Welcome back from the break, everybody. So we're going to move on to the second part of our Gothic lecture today, and we're going to talk about Italian painting in the Gothic period. And here we're talking mainly about one figure, Giotto, was an incredibly important painter in the history of Western art. So we're going to talk mainly about his work. And with this lecture, with this part, since it's the last one right before the midterm, I always go somewhat... I always leave a little bit of time at the end to give you tips about the midterm, and I see no reason not to do the same thing over the remote lecture here. So that'll be towards the end here. But first, let's talk a bit about Giotto, an Gothic Italian painting. And so the painting during this period, Gothic painting, you want to think of two influences. This is a little reductive. It's a little too simple. But essentially, you want to think of two key influences that merge to allow for Gothic painting. And so the first is Gothic statuary, especially French Gothic statuary from up north that we just saw outside of Last Cathedral, the visitation between Elizabeth and Mary. And the second influence, also really important, comes from the east, which is icon painting, Orthodox Byzantine icon painting, which we studied this semester already. So visually, you're going to be attuned to that influence. And so, right, when we talk about influence from up north, notice how naturalistic we talked about Elizabeth and Mary being. This is almost proto-Renaissance, and we're going to say the same thing about Giotto. There's something proto-Renaissance about his painting. So there's that influence, this naturalism that we're seeing on statues outside of cathedrals. And then there's also Byzantine icon painting, which is a key influence. So here you'll remember the Vladimir Virgin from our Byzantine art class. This was definitely a style that would get repeated over and over and over again in icon painting. The tradition, in some ways, is a static one, right? Because, of course, why improve on the original? It wouldn't make sense. So you have someone like Cimabue, an Italian painter, who is very likely, or it's thought of, was the teacher of Giotto. We have a work by Cimabue called Madonna Enthroned with Angels and Prophets. And you're seeing in this work that comes slightly before Giotto, you're seeing the influence of Byzantine icon painting. So you notice the head of the Virgin Mary, bigger, tilted to the side, almost balloon-like, the small pursed lips, the long, elongated nose, the eyes looking out right at you, pointing to the child that's on her lap. And again, this is not quite convincing baby. This is more like a miniature human. We're going to get convincing babies in the Renaissance, especially in the High Renaissance. Don't worry, we're going to get there. And everything is pretty stylized, pretty flat. You have these angels that are floating. You don't really have a sense of atmosphere or gravity. There's a flatness to it. You have 4 Old Testament prophets that are looking up, again, prefiguring this story. So with Cimabue, you have a clear influence of Eastern Orthodox, of icon painting. But even Cimabue is starting to do some different things. So you do get a little bit of a more sense of drapery, of body, of embodiedness from the figure of the Virgin Mary. And you'll notice she's enthroned, she's in this seat, and it's a bit concave. You're getting a little bit of depth. So while this feels like a weightless world without gravity, nonetheless, it does seem to have a bit of spatial distinctness. Like it does have a bit of spatial recession. Like you feel like there's a bit of depth there. So that's important. That's a step forward in some ways. But otherwise, still very much he's safely within the Byzantine tradition. And especially, notice the background, right? You have the halos and you have the golden background, just like you would in Byzantine icon paintings. So Cimabue is an example of an Italian painter who's definitely still within this tradition of Byzantine icon painting. So along comes Giotto, who again might be Cimabue's student. And while you're getting it's the same altarpiece. It's a Madonna enthroned. It's done just a few decades after this one, right? It's the same formula. You have the Madonna enthroned with the child. You have angels. You have Old Testament prophets, although in this one they're in the back here. The 4 are in the back. And you have 2 angels here. And I've always loved, in both of these actually, I've always loved the angel wings in Gothic period painting. It's these like black, golden, and red. It's just a fantastic design. And so while the format, the theme, the figures are very similar, and you should keep in mind that we're a ways away of pure artistic license. We're a ways away of the artist being able to do whatever he wants. Giotto, Cimabue, and even subsequent painters that we study in the Renaissance and forward, they're being patroned by people. They're being commissioned to make works, and the commissioner is going to say, I want tempura on wood, I want an altarpiece, I want it to be an enthroned virgin, I want it to have these specific details, right? Which then Giotto would have to follow through on, right? So clearly this type of altarpiece, a Madonna enthroned with angels, with Old Testament prophets, that this was a type. This was a commissioned type by the church, by commissioning bodies. But even within those limitations, Giotto is doing something quite different and quite radical from Cimabue. So this is one of those classic comparisons that if we were in class together, this would be where we would like to take a break and you would compare these two and tell me about the differences. Why is Giotto so radically new? Why is he further along or moving away or being more inventive with his figures and with the setting of the scene, with the sense of space, than his teacher, his maybe teacher, Cimabue, right? So for part of today's response, and I'll put this for your attendance, part of today's response, which I'll put in the document that I post with these videos, that you can just work with while you're watching this, while you're listening to me. I want you to take a pause here, pause on these two images, and take a moment, a paragraph or so, to compare these two works. Maybe slightly more than a paragraph. You might need more than a paragraph. Do a nice comparison of these two works, and in what way is Giotto radically new? In one way is his figure moving us forward in the history of painting. So now that you've compared the two works, Cimabue and Giotto, we can move on to the Arena Chapel, or the Scrivini Chapel in Padua, which contains probably Giotto's most famous, most celebrated paintings. The outside of this chapel, which would have been built around the time of Giotto's paintings themselves, looks modest. It's a nice little chapel, but it's when you get in that you see what everybody comes to see, which are these incredible frescoes that Giotto's painted throughout the whole Scrivini Chapel. Almost nothing in this chapel is not painted. Even the stuff that looks like it's just ornamentational marble, that it looks like it's stuff between the paintings, that's also painted. In the format, the spacing, and the composition of these frescoes are so perfectly attuned to the architecture itself that some even argue that Giotto had a hand in the architecture itself, the building of the building itself, knowing how his painting cycle would unfold along its walls. And so this is what it looks like when you walk in, and then if you turn around, sorry, this is a much nicer image. I wish I had as nice of images as I do from the other vantage point. If you turn around from the open doors, then you see, again, more cycles of paintings. All of these are stories from the New Testament, and there's no way we can go in and look at all of them. I mean, you have the whole Passion Play of the New Testament here. So we'll look at a couple. And of course, the ceiling is really quite beautiful. It's blue. You have these stars, so you get the sense of like the Christian cosmos. up at the ceiling. And then at the other end here, you have a scene that should be familiar to us at this point, and we'll look at it more closely at the end here, and that would be a Last Judgment, right? So here are some really celebrated ones. This is the miracle of Christ turning water into wine. One of the first miracles that he did, if not the first one, if I'm remembering correctly, in the scripture. Then over here you have Christ will appear in almost every single one. You have Christ raising Lazarus from the dead, so Lazarus looks like this mummy, it's like mummified. This is another miracle, right? So you're seeing the miraculous workings of Christ in the New Testament being pictured by Giotto. Then down here, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this one next because it's so famous. This is the Lamentation. This is the moment where Christ is taken off the cross after the crucifixion before he is entombed, before he resurrects in the story of the scripture. And then here you have a pretty well-known scene called Noli me tangere, which means don't touch me. And this is a scene after the resurrection where Mary Magdalene wants to touch Christ, and Christ says, no, don't touch me. And it's an enigmatic little scene, but often it's interpreted as, now that I've resurrected, you have to have faith. So you can't touch me. You have to have faith that I'm here. That I've been resurrected. So this is another one of these stories that have to do with a test of faith or faith for Christians. But notice, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on this just to get Giotto's style down and see what's so fresh and new about him for the history of Western painting. But notice everything else. You have all these little designs, all these little aspects here. Even the stuff that looks like it would be architectural sculpture or marble, all of this is painted, right? They're pretty remarkable frescoes. One day I'd really like to go to Padua to see these in person because they're probably pretty astonishing. So we'll take a look at the Lamentation a little bit more in length next, but I also wanted to show you the Last Judgment. So this is that scene right above the door where you come in, and it's a pretty remarkable Last Judgment scene. So you have, a whole chorus of angels. You have all these important holy figures. Again, Moses, the four evangelists, St. Paul, Mary herself is right here. And then an enthroned Christ, right? Radiating this heat, this big, circle of fire that's shooting forth to his left, to our right. And it seems like all these people, it seems pretty for sure that all these people are being damned to hell. You have demons, you have writhing bodies who are being sucked down, and then you end up having the river Styx down here. I'm sorry, not the river Styx. That would be Greek. But you have the opening to hell and this big demon. So all these people being damned here, and then on the right side of Christ, as so often happens in Christian visual culture, the right side is the good side. All these people who are saved. Then in the center here, you have two angels holding up the cross, designating the crucifixion. And then you have this interesting moment right here, which I can enlarge for you. You have, again, the Virgin Mary with two attendants, and a guy holding up a building, and another guy looks like he's offering up the building. He's giving the building to Mary. And this building, as you can tell, is none other than the Scribini Chapel itself. So the building that this fresco finds itself in is the building you're seeing in the fresco. And this guy, Scribini, he's the guy who built the fresco and commissioned Giotto, who built the chapel and commissioned Giotto to make these frescoes. And so something to note about Scribini, he was actually kind of a bad dude. His father, who's also named Scrivini, he's infamous, he's well known because he's in one of Dante's 7 layers of hell, if you've ever read Dante's Inferno. Scrivini was a banker who committed the sin of usury. Usury means to lend money and then charge exorbitant interest. But actually back then, so you could still use the word usury today, USURY. It's a good GRE word or LSAT word for you. You would use that today, like if you're being gouged by a credit card company, that means they're committing usury. But back then, usury could mean any type of interest whatsoever. Like if you lend money and then you ask for more in return, that was deemed to be sinful. Imagine that. Like our whole financial economy is basically the financing of capital today is basically founded on these forms of interest. Back then it was sinful. So his father was damned to hell in Inferno, in Dante's Inferno. Scrivini himself was also a banker, the son, and so there's a way in which some people read this. He's not only the patron, he's not only the one who commissioned Giotto to make these frescoes, and he's the one who dedicated and built this chapel to the Virgin Mary, but it's also in some ways like a penance, or like a way, an offering of asking forgiveness, or maybe like an insurance policy, if you want to think cynically about what he does in life, right? So it's interesting that he's been placed in the painting itself. And this might seem strange, but actually you'll see as we move forward, it'll be quite common to see the patrons, the people who commission the work of art, to be in the work of art itself, right? So we'll talk more about that when we talk about patronage in the Renaissance. And so there were all these incredible frescoes in the Scrivini chapel, but we really only have time to look at one in depth, and this is usually the one that's listed in books, the one that's reproduced in books. It's quite famous. It's the Lamentation. And so I just want to point out a few things that are very, very new about this. We haven't seen a painting like this at all this semester, and there are a few reasons for this. There are a few reasons that make Giotto's painting quite radical. So for one, there's the composition. Normally with everything we've seen, the center is the most important part. Arguably the center here is just right above, or maybe part of, this is St. John, right above his head. The figure you'd think would be most important would be Christ, but he's off in the lower corner here, right? So Giotto's done something really interesting here with a composition. Rather than just putting the most important person in the center, like an enthroned Virgin Mary, he's put it off to the left. And he set up the composition to be almost a diagonal. So you have this incredibly charged moment between mother and child. Your gaze might start here, and then you're then sent up along this cliff through St. John, and then you end up at this tree. And so the composition itself seems to be set up. There's a dialogue between this tree, this cliff, and then this structure right here. And if you go past this moment between Mary and Christ, then you get to this figure. This is also radically new. These figures that are seated, their backs are to you. So is this one. She's even getting in the way of the most important figure, which is quite amazing. And you don't see them. So here, Giotto is providing a sense of space. You get the sense that they're a framing device for a recession in space. So we don't have Renaissance perspective here yet, but you are getting this sense of depth, almost like this is a play. Almost this is like a scene out of theater, and these are all actors. So you're getting the sense of depth. And they all look like natural human beings. The only thing that's, let's say, otherworldly or divine or transcendent would be the angels flying up here. And they're all in various states of agony because, of course, this is the Lamentation. It's a scene of sorrow for Christians. And you have halos of holy figures. So here's Peter, this is Paul again. Of course, this is Mary Magdalene holding the feet of Christ, and this is Mary. And obviously Christ has a halo too. So all the holy figures have halos. So those are seen signs of divinity. But otherwise, Giotto is giving you like a very naturalistic scene. Even the sky itself isn't some uniform golden heavenly thing. It's blue, right? you're getting a sense of landscape, and you're getting a sense of actual gravity and people in space. So again, Giotto, his work almost looks more like you have people in a play that are acting out this scene. And this is important for two reasons. One, people seeing this at the time, they would identify with it. They would identify with these figures that look like normal, everyday people. And the other important part of this is that we know then that Giotto is an artist who's not really looking back to establish styles, but he's one of these first artists, and this is why he's so important, where he's looking at the everyday world. He's looking at the world around him. He's observing the world, people, landscapes, the way bodies move, the way bodies can be positioned in different ways that wouldn't just be formulas and cliches from the paintings that he's already seen. And so his radical way forward is to observe nature, is to record nature, and to use the natural world, human bodies, the sky, landscapes, the whole gamut, observing the natural world in order to translate these religious scenes. This is one of the reasons he's so radically new, and it's one of the reasons why he's often deemed to be proto-Renaissance. Some people have him as early Renaissance, right? This incredible naturalism that we're going to see in the history of Western painting. We're seeing the start of it here. And one other thing to say about the composition, which is important, because this isn't just willy-nilly, like I want to be adventurous and do something new, I'm going to put this, like the most important passage of the painting, down to the lower left. He's balanced it out with this cliff and this tree, so your eye kind of keeps going back and forth, or your eye might actually do a circle through the angels and then through these figures. It's almost like he has a doubled composition, a composition that's circular but also diagonal, and it works. It works really well. It's not all just willy-nilly. So this passage between the two phases and going up to the cliff and the tree, this is symbolic. This tree would not simply be a tree. This tree could be the tree of knowledge. It could be a reference to Genesis and original sin, right? Which would then make this a prefigurative relationship, right? Old Testament, Garden of Eden, original sin, and New Testament, the death of Christ, the death of the Messiah for Christians in order to absolve, to die for those sins, right? So this is not just a tree, a cliff, and a face-to-face. Like, this would be the most loaded, important relationship for Christians, right? And it's encoded, but in a very natural way. The tree could also represent the cross. The cross would have been made from a tree, and then by extension, resurrection, right? Because notice that the tree, at first you think it's dead, but it's not. There are little shoots of greenage that are coming out the tops. So this idea of trees coming back every year, this idea of resurrection, that may very well be functioning symbolically here with the overall story, right? So Giotto is showing you an incredibly naturalistic scene in painting with this is the first time you're seeing what looks like real psychological features on painted people, right? Real psychological features since antiquity, since those wonderful statues we looked at in Greece. So you have a sense of naturalism, of observing the natural world, and a sense of actual psychological complexity and emotion in Giotto that's radically new. So these are some of the many reasons why he's so important for the history of painting. Here's another one. I just wanted to show this because it's nice. There are a number of I'm going to go much more quickly now, but there are all sorts of passages in the cycle of frescoes in the Reina Chapel where you have this face to face, which is also very, very new, right? Normally, when you see Christ and Mary, especially let's say in icon paintings, they're always looking right out at you, right? They're not engaged with each other as much. Here, again, these are like two actors acting out this scene. And you're almost a voyeur looking out into it. So here we have another one. You have this incredible face-to-face, and in fact a kiss between Anne and Joachim, so the parents of Mary within the story. And this is a long, complicated story. This is the story where Joachim leaves, and then he finds out that Anne is actually pregnant with child who's going to be Mary, and he comes back, and this is when he's coming back, and they embrace. And you have this face-to-face. The halos merge, and it's like the faces themselves merge. And some scholars have argued that through the merging of this face, you have then a third face, like two eyes, nose, and mouth, right? And that third face is not so much Mary, as you might expect, because she's pregnant with Mary, right? But in fact, it's the face of Christ. Might be a bit of a stretch as an interpretation, because this face kind of ends up looking a bit cross-eyed. I don't know how well this works, but it's an interesting conjecture. It's an interesting interpretation that this face, the third face that's made possible by Joachim and Anne, that also then has a beard, that also reads as, let's say, somewhat male, would then be Christ as an adult, as a bearded adult. Kind of compelling. It makes some sense in the sense that these are the grandparents, right, of Christ himself in this story for Christians. And that's not the only passage in this cycle where you have this really dramatic face-to-face. This is the Kiss of Judas, another very famous fresco in the Scrivini Chapel. This is in the Garden of Olives, where Christ and all the disciples are being arrested. Notice Peter is always depicted as a hothead. He's cutting off the ear of a Roman soldier. This is Judas himself, in really incredible terms. He's like draping himself over Christ, and he wants to kiss him. This is the kiss of betrayal, right? And then you get, again, this face-to-face that communicates so much. You have this really sort of domineering, but almost like not affected face of Christ, just looking at Judas in a way that's, I don't know, it's psychologically complex. Maybe looking down at him, maybe judging him, or maybe forgiving him. It's a complicated face to read, whereas Judas looks a little bit more desperate. A lot of scholars notice that his face, the eyebrow, his brow, the eyes being recessed, the face itself, that he's made to look a little subhuman. He's made to look wrong in some ways. Some argue that he looks more like a monkey. He's animalized in some ways, right? To show that he's a sinister agent in this story. And so this face-to-face is loaded, very, very loaded, not unlike Joachim and Anne, and of course not unlike Mary and Jesus. So those are really nice passages inside this fresco. And I think you can tell, or I hope you can tell, that with Giotto, things are getting much more complicated. They get much more complicated to analyze, much richer to analyze as we move forward in the history of Western painting, as we're doing it in these next few weeks, or for the rest of the semester. So that's it. But one last little note. Very recently, a scholar has noticed something in the clouds in the Scrivini Chapel, and he's found a face. And he argues that this is the face of Satan. It's the devil, or it's the face of evil. And so I kind of like this. I think we would now call this an Easter egg. It's like Giotto put something in there that many, many generations later will then find. He just snuck something in, which I find kind of fun and interesting. So there you go. A scholar argues that is the face of the devil inside of the Scrivini Chapel. Okay, so that's it for Giotto. That's it for Gothic Italian painting. And so you can tell Giotto is incredibly important for Gothic Italian painting. And now I just want to end by offering up some tips for the midterm, which will be a take-home next week. So these tips are normally for the midterm in class itself, right? So it might be a little bit different, but hopefully this could still be helpful. So as far as names, titles, and works and time periods, well, now that doesn't really matter because, of course, if you're stuck on a name or whatever, what have you, I'm sure you're simply going to look at the book or you'll look at your notes, which is fine. So this is going to be a take-home exam. And that's really no big deal for me, because I think I've said this a number of times. I don't really care about memorization. I care much more about you being able to write something that's interesting and factual about any particular work. And so even when this is a blue book exam in the class, I always stress that anyway. So no big deal there. Try to learn some of these names. Like hopefully after this class, you know Giotto and you know Michelangelo and you know like these big names in history. But that's not really I don't emphasize that so much. So this exam will still be timed. I'm going to upload it on the website and you'll have the time of the class to do it. And it will still be, you're going to have a prompt. So each question will have a prompt. I may very well just do it in QuickTime like I'm doing now, and you can go through it at your own pace. Or just as a PowerPoint, right? You can just go through it at your own pace. So it will be prompted. Where I'm going to ask you a question, and so you're going to write, and so some of them will be smaller questions, like you'll have one work to work on. Some of them will be comparative. You'll have two works that you'll want to compare. So revisit our first art history lecture, where we went through the different registers of how you would talk about a work. So when you're answering this at home, be able to talk about the style, the composition, the materials used, what it looks like, right? Because this is a take-home, I'm going to expect a bit more here. So I'm going to want you to be attentive to what you're looking at as an object, like we did a little bit with Giotto just now. And then you're going to want to also talk about the big historical, religious, philosophical, economic, whatever it might be, like the big issues, the big ideas that we talk about. You're going to want to account for those as well. So an ideal response for this exam, whether it was a blue book in class or now in this format where it's going to be a take-home, the perfect answer is the one that does both, where you can do the micro level stuff, the composition, the materials, the style, what it looks like, and the big level stuff, the big ideas, the historical ideas. And so for the longer questions where you compare, you want to make sure not to compare too many things. You don't want to go crazy. You want to just tease out 3, at most 4 compelling similarities or differences when you're comparing. If they're really different from each other, focus more on the differences, because that'll generate the more interesting ideas, right? And don't talk about one and then the other separately. Don't, let's say you have that Cimabue-Giotto comparison. Don't talk about Cimabue and then talk about Giotto. You want to go back and forth and integrate them in your writing when you're doing the comparison, okay? So just to give you an example, I won't go through this because you'll just have it here now through the video, but basically, in a blue book, if this was in class, this would be a good answer, right? More or less. I'm going to be looking for a little bit more now that this is at home, longer, more intricate answers. But something like this, where you talk about the composition, you talk about some micro feature of the work, and then you talk about, let's say, a larger historical aspect of the work. So for a single work, when you're responding to it, that's perfect. You have one paragraph where you're describing the work, you're talking about the style, the materials that it's made of, you're talking about the formal characteristics of the work, and then the next paragraph you'll be talking about the bigger ideas, right? So each response for the single prompts where you just have one work, shoot for a couple paragraphs, right? We can skip that. Oh, I see. So that was simply something we would have, I forgot about this. This was something we would have practiced in class if we would have been in class together. But no need to do that for here now. So for a comparison, and we've done comparison in class, I would expect, let's say, 4 paragraphs or something like that. I'm not going to be judging too much length, right? Just use common sense. If you answer something in 3 sentences, it's likely that you don't have enough, right? If you answer a single work with just a few sentences, it's probably not enough. For a single work, you want at least like a couple paragraphs, reasonable sized paragraphs. Same thing goes for the comparisons with the longer questions. If you have one paragraph for this long comparison, probably not enough. You want one paragraph to probably do one thing, and you want to do like 3 or 4 things when you're comparing. So you're looking for at least, let's say, four paragraphs or so for the comparisons, right? But then you could go the other way. Like, don't send pages and pages and pages of a response. Like, don't write a whole long essay. This is not what this midterm is about. You're doing quality over quantity. You're just going to respond, give the essentials, say something factual and interesting, and then we'll call it a midterm, and it'll be good. So that's all I have for the Gothic and for your midterm tips. If you have any questions, just email me about the midterm. But again, it's going to be very cut and dry. And as a take home, it's going to be simply about you putting in the effort, and you should be just fine. So until next week, until the midterm, everybody stay well and stay healthy.